Welcome to the Cover Your Assets podcast. I'd say the goal of our podcast, this is pretty much episode number 2, is to educate business owners and business executives on, what security risks are out there and how you can combat those. Today we have Eric, who is our CMO, Eric Bowles, Sean Donahue, who is our Chief Information Security Officer, and Curtis Branham, our NOC Manager. So today we're going to kind of dive into the Verizon DBIR report, which is the data breach investigations report. Um, they analyzed over 30,000 security incidents, 10,000 plus confirmed data breaches in 2023. So this report essentially kind of breaks down what they found. What are some of the really persistent threats out there that kind of came to light in the research that they did, and it also kind of breaks down some good controls that every company should look at having in place to protect against those risks. So it's kind of a lot to dive into. Sean, being a subject matter expert, I guess just kind of at a high level, what are some of the things that you really kind of took away from this?
Well, I think kind of the TLDR, if you had to really summarize everything down into a single bite-sized piece of information, is that a lot of the information and a lot of the things that came up in a lot of the data breaches are things that have been coming up for a long time. So things like, credentials, compromise, phishing, and all of the usual suspects. But in addition to that, the alarming trend is that things aren't getting any better, right? So you're actually seeing that these things are remaining major sources of breaches. They're staying persistent. They're staying sticky. They keep happening over and over again, and they're just not getting any better. So, I think that says a couple things. I think it says, number one, from the perspective of a security professional in the security industry and security practitioners, maybe we're not doing our job well enough. Maybe there needs to be more education, more raising of awareness in companies about the importance of security and how to do your best, at least to mitigate a lot of these issues, but also that cyber criminals and threat actors are not going away. They're remaining aggressive. They're becoming more aggressive. They're broadening their attacks across industries, across types and sizes of organizations. And just in general, the security professionals still have job security, right? Because we still clearly have a job to do to try and protect people from these same types of threats that keep cropping up. Another thing that I thought was actually a big takeaway from it is there's a new type of cause of a breach that seems to be increasing in frequency, and that's exploiting vulnerabilities. And vulnerability exploits have been a common source of data breaches and hacks and compromise for a long time, but you're starting to see the frequency of this increase a lot. And it's happening through things like misconfigurations, applications where they're not deploying updates that are available. Sometimes they're zero-day exploits, and really with a 0-day, you can't do anything about it because nobody knows about it. And so all you can do is have a good security program ahead of such a thing so that when it does happen, you then can respond appropriately in the incident response phase. So I think there's a lot there, but I think the biggest takeaway is that the usual suspects are not only near the top of the list, but they're also increasing they're still increasing in frequency and even in scope. So those are some of the big takeaways.
So, Sean, quick question on that is, why do you think we're not in any better from a business perspective? Not from we as security, not we. I'm a marketing guy, but as an industry, as security practitioners, right? We continue to evolve and increase and adapt and all that. And Curtis, this is partly for you too, as the NOC manager, because you see this stuff come in and see these types of things happen. Are we not messaging it correctly? And what I mean by that is that we love to talk about all the nerdy, geeky stuff, whatever, the same way that CFOs like to talk about debits and credits being in the wrong column and crazy stuff like that, right? So why has the security posture of the business side not increased? Is it because there's just so many more threats, because they're happening faster, or because as business leaders we're not messaging this correctly to the people that need to be aware of phishing attacks and all those types of things? Like, or is it a mix of all of them or none of them?
There's really two things that come to mind for me. Number one, especially when you look at something like credential theft and identity compromise and things like that, and this is something Ian and I were just kind of talking about internally and lamenting, and that is complexity, right? So complexity meaning every organization of all sizes, they're using a plethora of applications. These applications, in most cases, all have different identity mechanisms and access control mechanisms. They all have different mechanisms to control permissions within it. And as businesses are moving forward, and I know a lot of the businesses I work with, right, they want to get business done. So what do? They go out and they find some SaaS application that's going to meet their needs, whether it's a project management application, an EHR, whatever it is. And I get the phone call and it's, hey, we just signed up with this EMR application. And, and then I said, well, don't you think perhaps I should have evaluated this from a security perspective and how this fits within everything else within your organization as far as access control, making sure that only the right people get access to the right information at the right time, right? Your typical, access control mantra, right? Shouldn't I have looked at that to see if it was going to actually fit within this before you went and did anything, so you actually did proper due diligence, right? And so then, invariably, what ends up happening is, A, it either never happens, right? And so now you have this kind of siloed application, and they just never even enabled MFA or some of the other basic security controls on it that they could have and should have, let alone something like SSO. So some of this comes down to that, right? So you have the complexity, you have application sprawl, and even for us as an MSP, it's a huge problem. We have all these applications, we have this whole tool set, and, part of my job now and one of the initiatives I have is how can I really tie this all together in such a way that it's well documented, well maintained, we know who has access to what, and we know that we can control as much as we can how they access it through a central place. So they have one identity. That identity can be controlled. They can access what they need and they can do things, right? On the other hand, in addition to that, some of it comes down to what I would call, to kind of use a football analogy, right? Everybody loves, right, the great quarterback who can throw the Hail Mary at the end of the game and win the game. But what really wins games over the long term? It's a strong ground game and a good defense, right? You need those things. You can have the best quarterback in the world, i.e. Dan Marino, right? He was one of my favorites, right? Heck of a quarterback. But he never won a Super Bowl. Yeah, right. Right. So I'm not a Dolphins fan, but I was a Dan Marino fan back in the day. But they didn't have a great defense and they had a poor ground game, so they didn't win Super Bowls. And I think the same thing is true in information security and cybersecurity, right? So often we overlook or we get bored with trying to consistently improve upon and push the fundamentals, right? Because everything's always changing, always evolving, right? And, change control is another matter entirely, but business is always moving, especially small and mid-sized business, right? And so I think, as security practitioners, to a degree, sometimes we just either get overwhelmed, overworked, or fatigued, and we just simply can't maintain control of this massive application and system sprawl. And so threat actors, on the other hand, they don't have that problem. They have unlimited resources, unlimited funding, and they're highly focused. When they have a target, right, they don't get fatigued. They just keep going and going and going until they're able to achieve their objective a lot of times. So I think it's kind of a complex mix of factors that really lead to this being difficult to contain.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm gonna chime in while you catch up on that. I think as an MSP and even internal IT, I've worked in internal IT departments before, and I've seen some of the same issues. That's I think one of the biggest challenges we have is getting buy-in from the stakeholders, which I think is kind of what you were originally asking, Eric. As an MSP, I think the challenge we have is probably educating better, even throughout the sales process and account management processes, on kind of helping the client understand here are the things that we can't control and we don't really need your help on. We can just kind of deploy this stuff, manage it, and we'll take care of it for you. For example, patch management, for the most part, we just deploy our agents, we take care of that. We have recurring tickets to make sure it's getting done. Um, but more to Sean's point, role-based access controls, for example, if that's something that we really want to implement someplace, typically we can't just go in there and kind of dictate, hey, this is a marketing manager, you're going to get access to X, Y, and Z. Human resources will have access to that. We can compile a certain amount of information and make recommendations on, what we might think would be right for the roles. But at the end of the day, we really, at some point, there has to be, meaningful communication and collaboration with a stakeholder within the business to really get that to the finish line and get that dialed in. I think, we had our lunch and learn on Copilot a few weeks ago. And a lot of that was really aimed more towards how to be ready for Copilot and what kind of security controls you should have in place before you even deploy it. I mean, that's really the biggest thing it hit on was role-based access controls and understanding where your data is at, who has access to it, and things of that
What's
nature.
the sensitivity of it, right? The classifying of it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then that also kind of dictates, you can spend as much as you want on identity access controls, identity access monitoring. But, in most organizations, you can likely get away with saying, well, you know what, this group needs that higher identity access management at these higher level of controls in place. It's going to be a little more expensive, but they have access to a lot more, so it makes sense to beef this up for them. Usually you can get kind of granular on who has what control and kind of extra security bells and whistles in place. And that can help drive it. But, and I think that's kind of, where we end up a lot of times is just kind of, well, we think your entire organization needs to put these controls in place because we don't really have, the buy-in and the collaboration we need with you to kind of define access better. So it seems like everybody kind of has more access than what they really should have.
Yeah. And
kind of, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, getting back to, that entire domain, right? So, getting back to Eric's original point, part of the challenge with business, any kind of business really, is there's still, and I don't care what your relationship is, internal IT, if you're an IT executive or an MSP or even a fractional CIO, CISO, it doesn't really matter. There's kind of this culture in a lot of companies, especially smaller businesses, where they really just perceive IT and security as this is broken, fix it. And no matter how much you try to train them and get them to understand, look, IT and security is not an afterthought in your business. It's a crucial component to the success of your business. It depends on it. And so you need to involve IT and security leadership in the same way you involve your financial leadership, your business leadership, your sales leadership. It's very much an integral part of this business, but yet so many times they make IT and security related decisions without actually involving the subject matter experts. It's crazy, but that's what they do. And then they bring them in after. It's like, hey, here's this new application we just bought, implement it, or make sure that users have user accounts and have access to it, right? So, and that's still something I see a lot today.
So I have a question on that, and I think that's a really good point in that, we've the last few minutes here we've been talking about nerdy geeky terms like identity access management and control and delegated access and what data is available and all that. We know that almost all cybercrimes are financially motivated, and what we see in the news is this United Healthcare got compromised, or these huge mega corporations. And it leads us to believe that we're just not a target because we have $1 million in revenue, $2 million, $750,000 in revenue. But we also know that 70% of these breaches from the DBIR report are credential related, and that 68% involve a human element, right? Which is would lean into credential stuffing and stuff like that. Like we mainly as K3, we mainly service more the SMB segment versus the huge enterprise. Curtis, how often are we seeing that type of activity where we're seeing security incidences and things like that, at the SMB level, for those that think that they're not a
I would
target.
say you're seeing it more and more, and I'd say they're coming in the form of like phishing emails, and that's a way that a lot of small businesses are being targeted.
Are we seeing a lot of those incidences at K3 with some of the clients where not that they're being compromised, but that there's an attempt to compromise that happens at the
Yeah,
SMB level?
yeah, every day. Yeah, that's happening all day long. People are trying to compromise accounts.
Yeah, yeah, and actually,
Yeah. So that's kind of my question is,
yeah.
right? Go
So
ahead. Go ahead.
to get back to the Change Healthcare breach, so that's actually a really good example because that is an example which very directly affected one of our clients. So the impact there is that they are using an EHR application. The EHR application uses Change Healthcare among other clearinghouses, right? So when you sign up for the application, you get to choose who is your clearinghouse that you're going to bill through. So anyone who is using this EHR, which is a larger EMR in the industry, EHR, and had chosen Change Healthcare, had their entire business and their ability to bill and collect revenue shut down. So not only was it an attack on Change Healthcare as an organization, it was actually a supply chain attack because then from there they were able to impact the revenue of every organization that was directly or indirectly using Change Healthcare as a clearinghouse. So the impacts are far and wide, and that was eye-opening to them because as a company, they were thinking, well, where are we directly vulnerable, right? They never thought for a moment, right, in even thinking about business continuity, that perhaps this clearinghouse, who we don't even directly have a relationship with, right, it's indirectly through our EHR application, could literally destroy our business. I mean, they came very, very close to going out of business entirely. And if the outage had lasted even a short time longer, they would be finished, the whole company. So
Let's talk about that financial impact real quick, right? Because we look at that so the way that I equate it as the dumb marketing guy, right, is that now at 50 plus years old, if I have to spend $1,500 to put 4 tires on my car, right, it's like it's expensive, but it's not the end of the world. Like I can afford $1,500, but I equate that back to being 19, 20, 21 years old and just out of college or going to college or whatever. Like $1,500 is an insurmountable amount of money, right? It's like, okay, one of my tires is flat. I can't be repaired. Now I have to put a new one on it. I can't afford $1,500 at this age. So I equate that to the SMB versus the enterprise space, right? And these SMBs, Curtis, you just said, and Ian, you just said, we see them every single day for the SMB market where companies are in fact at the size being targeted because it's not about a ransomware that's worth, 13, 15, $25 million. It might be a ransomware attack that's worth $25,000. But if it, as an attacker in another country, if I do that 10 times, 12 times, 15 times, 20 times over, and I make 25 grand off each one, that's a lot of money to me. And 25 grand as an SMB company or 50 grand or whatever might very well be a lot of money to you. So it's really about, you are in fact a target. I mean, would you say that's correct? Is that they're definitely still a target. They just don't think they're a target because we never hear about them. But there is financial motivation behind that.
Yeah. Well, it's something else you kind of touched on is extortion of that data, right? So I feel like things have changed a little bit. 10 years, I feel like it was more about ransomware. Somebody's going to get in, encrypt your files, and then they're going to ask for a ransom so that they can make their payday from that. And either you pay the ransom or you restore from a backup, and that's how you recover. And I think a lot of people, probably myself included, when this first started happening, you just kind of got in the mindset of, we got to make sure we always have good backups and a good DR plan, and we'll be back up and running relatively quickly, depending on how much we invested in the DR plan. But where I feel like that's really shifted over the last, let's say, 2 to 3 years, I've seen more of a shift to this, or I have heard more stories, is I feel like oftentimes it's a lot more about data extortion, or data exfiltration. So they're actually, when they get into your system, the goal is to basically export as much of the data as they can and figure out how they could use that for some kind of monetary gain. And that's kind of more of the objective than just locking you out of your files. As a matter of fact, I almost feel like I've seen a trend where they try to be as quiet as possible, that they are in your systems, so they can kind of figure out what you have that's valuable and then extort you based off of that. Would you kind of agree with that, Sean, or
100.
do you feel like being such?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and that's the, if you look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right, that's the whole kill chain, right? You do your reconnaissance, you probe, you gain access, you maintain access, right? You elevate your privileges first, maintain access, then you begin, doing internal reconnaissance work and gathering and exfiltrating data. Yeah. In fact, most large breaches, and it's kind of alarming, but most large breaches, I don't know what the current statistic is, but over the last couple of years, the statistic was the attackers had access to the victim's environment for usually on average at least 6 months before they were detected. So imagine that. Somebody had gained access to your environment through whatever the attack vector was. They were able to maintain access and be present in your environment for at least 6 months before you even knew about it. But here's the kicker. This wasn't, in the SMB space, we're talking large enterprises with multi-million dollar, sometimes 8-figure budgets for information security, and still the statistics held true. That these attackers were able to gain access, they were able to maintain access, and they were able to achieve their objectives of exfiltrating the sensitive data from the network. So I would say 100% that's definitely a shift.
So now let's kind of loop that back to the AI discussion, right? So right now it's taken an average of 6 months to cut for the attackers to essentially find the information that they need to make some kind of monetary gain off of that. Let's say that they kind of reach into Microsoft's account that has Copilot attached to it. The whole idea of Copilot is information right at your fingertips. You ask it what you need, and it points you right to it. So I think that changes the landscape a lot. And it's not just Copilot; there's tons of AI tools out there. So if you start implementing SSO with some of those AI tools, and that account is breached, or if you don't have SSO tied to that, and you have really no kind of monitoring of that tool they use, but there's a bunch of proprietary information in there. People or attackers are going to be able to get to that information a lot quicker and achieve those objectives a lot faster.
That's a really interesting point that you bring up, because I was really sitting here thinking through this from we obviously know the risk to healthcare, because if they compromise customer or patient data, now my data as one of their patients is potentially out there in things that I don't want them to know and whatever, right? But think about, like, from a perspective of an architecture, engineering, construction firm, something like that, or a creative agency. It's like, what are you going to do? Steal our Photoshop files, or steal our CAD files, or whatever? Like, it's really not worth that much. But to your point, like, I can get in there and leverage Copilot to start digging through SharePoint, Excel, financial records, whatever, and find financial information about your business and expose that to the world, where your customers now know, A, that you're not secure, B, that there's potentially payment information in there, bank information in there. Is my bank information in there as a customer, or is it just the business? Exposing all your financials, like all of those things. And, so, not only AI, but, Curtis, I think you probably know a lot about this. With now that we've moved to this distributed model where people aren't sitting in the office as much anymore, it used to be, right, it was real easy. Like, we stood up a firewall and it ran at layer 2, and it either blocked packets or it allowed packets. And then we went to layer 3, layer 3, where it did like heuristics and signature analysis. So we could do fancy stuff with our firewall. Like, I understand what that traffic is, and so I'm going to block it, even though it's not from the IP that I wanted to block. But it's a totally different ballgame now. And I know, Curtis, you just went through a bunch of certifications about a whole lot of this stuff related to security. How do we protect against something like that? If I'm an architecture engineering firm, if I'm a creative firm, I mean, obviously, if I'm a healthcare firm or anything
Yeah, that's
else.
a good question, especially when you bring up people working from like all over the world now, or working remote. So I guess to start from like an endpoint, or like your computer perspective. So using tools such as like endpoint detection response, or like antivirus solutions that can look for those like persistent footholds that Sean was talking about earlier. And then when you talk about like cloud-based applications, you would want to consider things like conditional access policies, so you can block access to those applications from like areas that you obviously wouldn't be at, or automated things such as like blocking impossible travel and things like that. And then, of course, multi-factor authentication as a next step.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the important thing to realize, and you kind of hit on each area, you're not going to 100% prevent attacks. And you're probably not going to 100% detect every attempt at an attack. So I think, everything Curtis just mentioned is kind of a combination of prevention. So hopefully you stop it from ever happening. Detection. So if it does happen, hopefully you catch it before it really does damage. And then response. Somebody actually got in, you didn't detect it. Now bad things are happening. How do you respond and recover from that? Um, and I think that, that might be a good segue right there. How do you respond to that? Where does that start?
Oh, sorry, that one's for you. So so in response to that, so yeah, you would use automated tools that can obviously like when a scenario like that happens that's like I guess doesn't match the baseline of like a typical interaction with an account, you would hope that would be like automatically blocked, and if not, you would have a good incident response plan so humans that have that expertise in security can react to those quickly and then stop the threat or mitigate it, and then do research to see like basically how did this occur, and then put in I guess roadblocks so that doesn't occur in the future.
Yeah. So when it comes to incident response, the first step in incident response is to have a plan and have a procedure, right? And that's where businesses, they fail right off the bat because, I don't care what type of business it is, right? They're doing business with these other companies. They're sending them these agreements and things like that. You have a written information security policy, you have an incident response plan, and these companies, they want the business. And so then they come to somebody like me and they say, hey, can we sign off on this? Are we good to say we've got all this? And my response is no. No, you're not, because you don't have any of these things to any meaningful degree, right? So incident response starts with the incident response plan, which ahead of time if there's an incident. And an incident can be anything. It can be, help, the hard drive on my server failed. It doesn't have to be something malicious that, it could be a technical failure. It could be an attempted breach. It could be an actual breach that's happened. So number one, it's understanding the kinds of things that can happen, the incidents or the events first. And then number two, it's understanding, okay, we're in the heat of the moment. We're stressed. It's a crisis. How do we respond to these various kinds of events? And so, the first step in real incident response is understanding, okay, what's the nature of the event? What's the impact of the event? What's the scope? The same thing you'd look at in really any kind of an incident, even, a help desk incident, right? What's the nature of it? What's the impact? So trying to understand that, and then based on that saying, great, now how do we respond in such a way that we can try and cut off or mitigate, right? We're trying to sort of limit the blast radius, if you will, of this incident, depending on the type that it is. So then from there, now we can go look into, okay, how do we now begin to either remediate fully, recover, do we have to, keep this isolated? And so you kind of have this whole plan that you need to have that would really dictate the right response depending on the kinds of incidents. And then you get into the things you would with disaster recovery, right? Role playing different scenarios and things like that. So that way, in the heat of the moment, when something does happen, you're able to respond appropriately and you're not going to panic or freeze like a deer in the headlights. So I think the biggest thing isn't even the technical. It's starting at the administrative level, kind of at the operational level, and saying, hey, we need to have an incident response plan. What are the kinds of incidents that can happen? And then kind of boil that down into a generic, repeatable plan for when that happens, this is how we respond. Just like an airline pilot, right? When an airline pilot is in a situation where, they have to enact emergency maneuvers, they typically do so expertly and almost automatically because they've rehearsed it so many times. And I think when it comes to incident response and things like that, having that culture within your information security team, within your IT team, so you're always aware of, boom, this happens, you're just following the plan that you've rehearsed so many times, like any other, high stress, just like professional athletes, right? They react automatically because they've trained themselves to do the same thing over and over and over again in difficult situations. Or soldiers, military. It's the same thing in information security. It's having the plan, it's knowing the plan, it's rehearsing the plan, so that way it becomes automatic. And so you can now work the plan when you need it. So. That's my take on incident response and how you go about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a good segue into just how does an organization manage and implement security as a whole? And I think what's important for a lot of organizations to realize is that there needs to be some kind of methodical approach to it. I think a lot of them, and even MSPs, less mature MSPs, I think they tend to just kind of find certain products or services that do certain things and they decide to implement it. And sometimes those are good products and services, but I think a lot of times they don't really tie it all together and kind of look at kind of to your point, Sean, what are all of the risks within the business, and what controls should I have in place to kind of combat those? One thing that I liked about the DBIR is that actually, and this is, I guess I'm partial to it because, our MSP stack is framed around the CIS control, the Center of Internet Security. And it actually kind of outlined, here's the CIS controls that can combat, a lot of the things that we talked about. But of course, the first one, as that tends to be with just about any security framework that you look at, is asset management, inventory management. And, that goes back to when I feel like you and I talk about constantly, Sean, is, you can only protect what you have. And, whether that's an application. And I think that's another important thing to point out. You talk about assets and inventory with a lot of business owners, and their mind kind of immediately goes to
Money.
where my laptop's at.
Laptops, desktops, money, physical things, but it's not anymore.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, Curtis just mentioned it earlier. Most companies are at the very least hybrid. A lot of times 100% remote. We have, I'd say probably 15-20% of our clients are 100% remote at this point. So yeah, it's important to know where your laptops are at and, how do you wipe that device or make sure that nobody can get into the device if it gets stolen and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, most of your data, anything that's really important to your business, is typically hosted completely outside of the device in somebody's data center, or maybe you have it with Azure, or maybe you have another third-party SaaS app. So it's really important to get a good handle on where is that at, what's stored within those applications, and then looping it all the way back to the beginning, what roles have access to what data within that system. And I think that's kind of step number one, implementing any kind of meaningful security within an organization.
Yeah. And kind of that brings it back to the whole analogy that I like to use too about the ground game and the defense, right? Kind of those unsung heroes within, the football world, for example. Well, it's the same thing in the information security world because, things like asset management, configuration management, patch management, right? All those things that are so important. Security awareness training, I mean, everybody hates that, right? They have to watch these videos and they get these simulated phishing emails and stuff like that, right? Nobody likes that, or nobody likes to have to sit through this stuff that's not related to their job that they don't even want to be at in the first place, right? But it's just so critically important because, as you can see in the report, it's those very same things that are a byproduct of not having this that are continually exploited. And, the thing is, cybercrime is a business like any other. Their goal is to make money. Not honest money, but their goal is to make money. And it's well-funded. They are well-funded, and what they're going to do, just like anybody with a brain, is they're going to find the easiest way possible to make money. So if the easiest way to make money is to be able to phish somebody, get their credentials, get into the application, steal the crown jewels, be able to traverse the network and move laterally because they don't have network segmentation and other things in place, right? Guess what they're going to do? They're going to keep doing the same things over and over again until it doesn't work anymore because that's the easiest way to make money. Why fix what isn't broken? So to bring it back to the report, why would you expect to see a change in the data or a change in the trend when the same things that have been working for years and years and years just continue to work for them today? And a lot of it is because the things that are necessary are difficult, they're messy, it's hard to maintain control of assets because people are always getting new computers, they're always signing up for new applications. And don't even get me started on shadow IT, right? Betty over in accounting, oh, you know what, I hate OneDrive, I'm just going to use Dropbox, right? And all of a sudden, all your financial data is syncing with her home PC. Or, you know what, forget this Microsoft Edge, I'm going to use Google Chrome, and I have administrative rights because I have to use QuickBooks, and IT had to give me administrative rights, and yes, I'm going to sign in with my personal credentials in Chrome and store the bank credentials, right? The bank login in my personal Google profile that syncs with every other device. And then, whoops, her home machine gets compromised and all of a sudden somebody has access to the bank account. That's just one example, one real life example of how this stuff can happen, right? And so
and that is a perfect example right there. As you were talking through that, like, right, like I sync, I do it in Chrome and not realizing that I'm signed into my personal Google account, not realizing in the background it's syncing, not realizing where all my data is going. Like, it's not malicious on my part, right? Don't assign malice where
yeah,
ignorance is a better fit. It's that I just
yeah,
don't know. And so, how much of this stuff is bringing it all the way back to, they say the problem is usually between the chair and the keyboard, right? It's the person. And the DBIR confirms that with 68% of all breaches being, involving human beings. Is that, how do we address this with human beings where, I think we've discussed this before, but I had a friend of mine that one morning at the gym, he was like, how do I get ChatGPT to create PowerPoints? And I was like, well, you don't, because it doesn't create PowerPoints. He's like, that would explain it. He's like, I kept uploading, our quarterlies and asking it to create a PowerPoint, and it kept telling me what PowerPoint was, but it wouldn't actually create a PowerPoint. And I was like, pump the brakes, back up. I was like, you uploaded quarterly what's? He's like, our quarterly financials. And I was like, to a public cloud that you don't control. And he was like,
yeah,
oh shit. I'm like, yeah, like it didn't even dawn on him that was a really, really bad idea. And again, it's not malice. It's ignorance of, did I just take all of our financial data and stuff it into a public cloud somewhere with an AI large language model that takes all that and harvests it?
yeah,
Like, people have a specific job to do, and they want to do that job as fast and efficiently and as easily as possible. And so we don't think about the security perspective of, it's like changing a tire on the side of the road, right? You're like, yeah, I want to get off the side of the road as fast as possible. So I jack my car up and I'm pulling the tire off and whatever. And you drive past them and you're like, you're on a hill and your wheels aren't chocked. And you're leaning underneath your car that's got a tire off of it and it's up in the air. Because my only goal right now is to get a new tire on it so I can get the heck off the side of the road, not realizing that if the car rolls, if the jack gives out, whatever, I'm underneath it.
Well, I think you guys are kind of hitting on something again. I think that security as part of your culture, right? So we've talked about policies and security awareness training, all of that fun stuff. But something you said earlier, Sean, was essentially something to the extent of a lot of times business owners, executives, whether it's in-house IT or an outsourced provider, they tend to just kind of shove things to IT and security and expect you to kind of fix them. When it comes to putting together a meaningful security program, there's policies that you have to get buy-in on from your managers. In the case of shadow IT, a lot of times it's probably only going to be the managers, if anybody, that's really going to realize that, maybe an accountant is using Dropbox or somebody's uploading quarterly financials to ChatGPT, things of that nature. And you really have to, number one, educate them on what should and shouldn't be done. But number two, kind of empower them to kind of train and mentor and coach the users to make sure that they aren't using the wrong tools or uploading data to places they shouldn't upload it. And I think that's where you really, or where business owners can really kind of start to realize this is how you kind of start ingraining this within your culture. Is really educating the leaders and the managers within your business so they know what's acceptable and what's not. In a lot of cases, there might be controls we can implement to help limit some of this or detect some of this when it's happening. But the problem is a lot of those tools end up limiting your functionality a lot. And it causes issues with productivity and efficiency. If you start blocking every other file sharing software out there, we have a lot of clients that don't use Dropbox, but they work with a client that uses Dropbox. So if we block Dropbox for them, that means now they can't get to the client data that they're trying to work with. So there's always, when you get to stuff like that, sometimes there's only so much we can do from a technical control standpoint. And unfortunately, you get to a point where you're dependent on the people within the organization, just understanding the do's and don'ts and doing the right thing.
Yep.
So, Ian, you and Curtis were just saying a little bit ago, right? Like at the beginning of this podcast, you were like, we see this every single day. Like we see attempted breaches every single day. And for the last, 15, 20 minutes, whatever it's been, we've been talking about some fairly sophisticated threat surfaces and attack vectors and things like that, which are probably all gobbledygook to somebody at an AEC firm or a creative firm or whatever. As Curtis as the NOC manager and Ian as you being involved with this as well, like what do we see that are the most common, like stupid, simple, low-hanging fruit threat attempts that are potentially catching businesses, with their hand in the cookie jar, essentially, or catching them, with their pants down, whatever you want to, however you want to phrase it. Like, let's boil it down to like the most simple things, where it's like, not like, we've got this super complicated, sophisticated attack. It's like, this is the really stupid things that happen on a very regular basis that end up catching, putting businesses in a compromised
Yeah, so I
position.
guess I'll start off. So again, going back to what I was talking about earlier and saying phishing emails, like you would be surprised how like how a simple phishing email can really get through and compromise someone. And with a little bit of security awareness training, they would probably be able to spot that. But I would say those are probably the biggest that I see. It could be an email that basically saying, hey, someone got into my bank account, and you can clearly, if you had a little bit of background knowledge, you'd be like, okay, that's clearly fake. But
Yeah, that's that right there. See that example right there. I've been seeing that for years and years and years, and I always ask myself, how on earth can somebody be so careless that they'll get an email that says, "Hey, I got a new bank account, right? Or I had to change my bank, or I have a new routing number, or whatever the case is. Please update my payroll and direct deposit." And somebody, like, especially if it's like the CEO, right? And there's not going to be any kind of checks and balances. They just literally care so little about their job. It's like, okay, I'll just go and do this. Like, it always baffles me how, and that is part of it too, right? Part of it is just plain old carelessness. And I think managers in these organizations, they have to really be on guard with these people in these jobs that are handling our finances, our intellectual property, our patient information. They're really checked out. And so if they see those warning signs, they actually need to be either willing to sit down with them and say, hey, look, you're doing a lot of careless, I'm noticing patterns, if you will, of careless behavior before it even gets to the point where they do something like that and wire out $250,000, So I think that's part of it too. That's another part of the human element. You can train people or attempt to train people all you want, but if you're hiring people into these roles that are just plain old checked out, that's another level of management I think that needs to go on. And it's the same thing in the managed services industry, right? I used to own an MSP. You work with people who are working in these lower level positions. Maybe they're on the help desk or they're a field tech. And you can just tell they're checked out. They're going to do something stupid. Right? And so somebody puts in a ticket, hey, can I have the, SA password for the SQL Server? And it's like, oh yeah, here you go. And they just email it out, right? The SA password for this SQL Server, which contains patient health information, for crying out loud. And so, there's levels of security awareness training, and part of that is making sure that these people even have the wherewithal and the due care to really even exercise their job role in a careful fashion.
that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And we're still pretty much hitting on, security really being part of a company's culture.
Yes.
I think, again, we can only do so much. And if we don't have the right people in the right spots helping to oversee the things we're talking about, when it comes more to the human element, there's still going to be an incident at some point. Specific to wiring money to the wrong place, there should be processes and accounting.
Yeah.
If you do get a request, whether it's legitimate or not, to change, wire information for a big transaction, there needs to be some kind of procedure and checks and balance to make sure that checks out.
Yeah, there's dual control. There's either dual control, you need someone else above you to authorize that, or you need to verify that with the person requesting it via a different channel, like a phone call or text or something that's a known secure channel, not the email or whatever the case is. But yes, have procedures for those kind of sensitive transactions like that. But you'd be surprised how many people, and I've seen this happen, not in just SMBs, but we're talking businesses that do $50 or $100 million a year, larger companies, and the people in their finance department will just accept this. It's like, oh, okay, because they just are that. They're just really that. The best way I can put it is they're just checked out of their job, where they do not care. They don't have the organization's best interest in mind because they don't even want to be there. And so, That's something that I think people have to be aware of.
Is it that they don't want to be there and they don't care, or is it that they genuinely just don't understand and just don't know? No different than if I were to go in and be like, my doctor's like, what is your diet like? And you're like, yeah, we go out to a restaurant here and we do this and we do that and I do this. And he's like, oh my God, you're putting that in your body. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, Jesus, he's like, it's terrible for your heart. He's like, no,
I think it can be either. I think in some cases it depends on the type of position, but it can be both. Right. So I do think there's a large number of cases where they're genuinely unaware. They genuinely don't know. And if they see something coming in that's spoofed as the CEO or one of their superiors, they genuinely want to be helpful. Right. And they don't want to get in trouble. So they want to do their job. But in other cases, right, because I've actually seen it firsthand, there are people in certain positions who are just genuinely don't care. Right, and so they're not exercising a role, in which case they could do, potentially significant damage to the organization with the appropriate care that they need to. So it can be carelessness in some types of roles. And I see that especially in technology roles.
Yeah. And I think, people that are either in a faster paced role or faster paced environment, I think that they tend to be a little riskier as well. At any C-level, for example, they typically receive a ton of emails every day. And if we're talking about, email compromises, phishing emails, a lot of times those kind of roles, they just kind of get in the habit. At the end of the day, I'm trying to get through my inbox. They start responding to links, clicking on links within those emails that they're just not really, they're not 100% there as they're kind of going through that motion. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's carelessness. They're just trying to catch up on their emails, right? And they have a lot going on.
Yeah. So it could be a lot of things.
So as a business, let's, again, say that I'm a creative agency or an AEC firm or something like that. I mean, obviously, the marketing guy in me would be like, hey, what's the first thing you should do? Call K3. Let's have a conversation. You need somebody that's focused on security and on infrastructure and on moving your business forward. But taking that out of the picture, taking that element out, like what is some of the easy to check off, like tangible things like that we could start doing? Let's say that I own a construction firm or a creative agency. What are some of the things that we could do, like right off the bat, like start doing today that make us less of a attractive threat to hackers and stuff like that, based on what we're seeing with, 68% of all breaches involve humans and, 40% of it's phishing and 70% is credential related and all that. Like, what are some of the things that are super easy that we could start checking off the box, today?
So easy, but time consuming. Create an inventory of where everything is at, and whether that's an application, file storage system, the hardware itself. This kind of goes back to what we said earlier. You're not going to be able to protect anything until you know where everything is at. So I think that would be kind of step number one. And that's probably going to require, like I said, it's going to be time consuming. You're probably going to have to go sit down with each department to get an idea. When we go through that exercise with clients, that tends to happen a lot where, maybe we're working with a point of contact, but typically takes them a couple of weeks to get back to us because they're going around to each department manager to really make sure they actually understand who's using what and what is that used for and what kind of data is stored in there and things of that nature. So I think that's really step number one. But then once you have that list identified, another thing we come across a lot is there's an opportunity for consolidation. We've talked about file sharing a lot. We've seen environments where they have Dropbox, Box, SharePoint, 3-4 different file sharing solutions out there. In some cases, the data is duplicated across all of them. Or in some cases, each department is using something different. But when you start getting to a point where you want to implement more meaningful controls, if you stick with 4 different solutions, number one, it's going to be a lot harder to organize things, really secure it in a meaningful way. But it's also going to be a lot more expensive. If you have it to buff each one up to an enterprise level so you can implement, for example, that's going to cost a lot more than if you just have one solution that you really have to kind of get nailed down and secure more. So, I think that's really kind of the starting point for everybody. I feel like just about every client we onboard, when we kind of ask that question of, hey, where is your data? What applications are you using? I don't know that we've ever gotten that answer right off the bat without kind of going back and forth for a few weeks.
Yeah. So,
and then once past that, that's when you can really kind of start looking at what controls make sense to implement based on where is your data and how is it used.
Yeah. So speaking from the perspective too of dealing with a lot of that in environments of all sizes, getting back to Eric's point about what can you do today, low hanging fruit to try and reduce that attack surface as immediately as possible. If you look at where the big vulnerabilities are it's going to be authentication or credential related. It's going to be phishing related, which is oftentimes how they get those credentials. And it's also going to be security, what they call security misconfigurations or patching and things like that. So kind of the lowest hanging fruit is, let's say you're starting to work with a client today. The immediate things you can do is begin making sure that your patching is happening. It's happening on a regular basis. Your machines are up to date. It's happening for your third-party applications like Chrome and Zoom and all the other things that are in use, right? That's low-hanging fruit. Another thing is once you begin to gain an inventory of the plethora of applications in the environment, it's understanding that, okay, it's going to take time to consolidate these things. It's going to take time to find all of them, and it's going to take time to eliminate them. So one of the most immediate things we can do is, as long as they're here, we can use the appropriate type of access control, which means MFA is an absolute must. If there's anything without MFA enabled that supports it, you have to immediately go in and do it. Email security, right? If they aren't using any kind of meaningful email security, and I mean, today, if you're using Microsoft, you're using at least some level of email security, right? But whether it's tuning what you have or bringing in a third-party product that hopefully will capture as much of that malicious email or phishing attempts or whatever it is filter as much as possible, and then you bring in security awareness training. So if you start with kind of those controls and at least attack what you have while simultaneously you're beginning that process of inventory and consolidation and understanding what are the assets and applications, right? Because it is a process, but I think you can have some quick wins just by immediately going in and strengthening the access control, strengthening the email security, the phishing control and things like that, and then beginning the process of employing, because I've seen quick wins already, even with some organizations I work with, where prior to me working with them, I mean, they were like getting compromised by stupid things. And now with just a little bit of security awareness training, right, they're actually forwarding me these emails and saying, hey, what is this? What do you think about this? This looks suspicious. They're not clicking on it, right? Or even if it is legitimate, if they're unsure, they know, let me ask somebody first, right? And so even a little bit does go a long way. And so one thing you'll find is you can begin turning around that culture relatively quickly, as long as you get a little bit of buy-in, right? And they feel like, hey, I have somebody I can go to if I have a question, right? Because they just want to get their job done. So if they do see something questionable, having that resource they can go to and say, you know what? Is this legit? And I can say, yeah, it either is or it isn't, or hey, congratulations, this was a simulated phishing email. And then I can give them some additional pointers. So it's kind of that, ongoing conversational approach to helping them improve their ability to spot and avoid these kind of threats. So that's my take.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add to that is, we talked a little bit about what I think is another common one is, wiring money to the wrong place, or wiring or changing payroll information for somebody through a phishing email. I think, when you talk to a lot of accountants or HR and payroll people within companies, a lot of times they'll tell you, yeah, we have a process around that. And then you ask, well, can I see it? Let me see what it looks like. And they don't actually have a written process. It's something that's in somebody's head. So I think that's another thing is, anything you do have processes around that are unwritten, get those out on paper. And, if possible, I think even going to the extent of, get that process really dialed in, review it with management, make sure everybody's kind of on the same page. I think even get into a point where you have, people that actually perform those roles, read that process and even sign an acknowledgement, that tends to carry a little more weight because now they actually sign a piece of paper saying, yes, I read and acknowledge what this policy needs.
Having stuff in writing is a whole other podcast and why you should.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
The documentation
Documentation
podcast.
podcast. Yeah.
We're just going to have hundreds of people tune in
That's
for that.
that's
Yeah,
the late
super.
night podcast when people have insomnia.
So,
No, I think we can wrap it up. Anybody out there that watches this, what I would encourage you to do if you have an existing provider, have some of these conversations with them and confirm what they're actually doing, in terms of the security awareness training. What does that look like? Can they give you a report on when is the last time everybody completed that? Do you have a couple of repeat offenders that just seem to refuse to do it? The other thing I encourage with security awareness training is have an internal stakeholder help with that and lead that. We recently implemented a policy, or I guess a process around how we do that. So essentially, we now require a stakeholder within the client's business to really kind of take lead on the training campaign. So we get it all set up, we figure out what content to put out there and stuff like that. But typically, we'll give like either the HR manager or the ops manager access to the portal so they can see who's completed the training, and we kind of make them take lead on ensuring the employees actually completed it. Because the issue is if you have a third-party provider, myself or Curtis or somebody at K3 sending them an email, for example, that typically isn't going to carry as much weight as if the ops manager or the HR manager starts harping on them about training that they need to complete. So you really, again, that kind of, I think, speaks to, kind of making security part of the culture and making sure that they realize this is something leadership wants you to do. This isn't just something that some guy at K3 or your current MSP is asking you to complete. So I think, just having those conversations with and patch management, ask to see some reports to confirm that patches are being deployed timely. And if they do vulnerability scanning, see if you can take a look at those. If there's any high critical vulnerabilities that haven't been patched, figure out what you can do with them to fix that. But I think, just having that conversation, the two-way collaboration with them to make sure you understand what they're actually doing for you and how they're doing that goes a long way.
And even if you don't have a third-party provider, let's say that you've got a one-person, three-person, five-person internal IT team, right? Security is a full-time job. So if you've got a three-person IT team internally and they're continually, changing out toner in the copier for Danny and, teaching Susan how to press in the power button and hold it for 3 seconds so her machine actually boots, and, all the other low-level stuff that help desk and IT people normally do, right? Onboarding a new employee, there's a million things going on. It's not that they don't care about security. It's that they literally have no time at all to even think about security because end user problems, not security related, just regular tech related, right? Like, Dan in finance wants to know for the 13th time in the last quarter, how do you use pivot tables again? Right. Like that's the real issue. I think even with internal IT teams is it's not that they don't want to look at security. They'd love to look at security. They have absolutely no time to look at security because they're so busy doing end user management, which is a full-time job all on its own.
Yeah. That's a really important point. I think as a business owner or executive within an SMB, if you're a 200 to 300 person company, if you do have internal IT, chances are it's probably only one or two people. You think about the different hats that they have to put on. It's end user support, system administration, whether that's administrating cloud systems or on-premise systems or stuff that you have at the data center. It's a lot to spread across one or two people. Typically, they're not going to be able to get to everything. So I think it's worth, opening that a lot of communication with them to figure out where they're struggling, where they could use some help, potentially bringing in more resources specific to taking care of the security initiatives, or potentially partnering with the third-party service to help achieve those goals. But a lot, again, I think to your point, Eric, I think the intentions of most small IT departments are, and there's a lot they want to do. But when you have that many roles or responsibilities spread across that few people, it's hard to get to everything. And a lot of times, end user support is going to take precedence because if somebody at the counter or somebody's performing a critical job role can't do their job because something's down, that's gonna be the first thing to work on. And the other offer I would make, if anybody wants to have a chat about, what do they have in place right now and how could they improve it? And that's, not a sales pitch I'm throwing out there. That's just more if you want to have a conversation and actually, figure out what meaningful progress you can make towards security. I love talking to people about that kind of stuff. There's been a few people I've done that with recently where we just kind of talked about what they have in place right now and what they might be able to do to improve that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also extend that to say, this overwhelm issue isn't just a problem with, your lower level techs and your internal IT departments, but also for your IT and security managers too, because, oftentimes in a smaller organization, the director of IT is also the director of security, right? They're not large enough, or they're a, CIO or similar title, right? Where they really have the responsibility for the overall IT leadership. They have the responsibility for the overall security leadership, and they too are overwhelmed as well. And they're being pulled in so many different directions, right? They're having to do things to meet these business objectives. They're having to support these applications and implementations and projects and redesigns and all the technology stuff. And at the same time, in the midst of all this change and evolution going on in companies, they're trying to support and further security initiatives as well. And so, even getting kind of the support and the additional resources there to be able to offload some of the tactical IT stuff so that they can be more laser focused on the higher level strategic and security related issues so they can drive that. So, yeah, I mean, there's really, no matter what the role is in the organization of who's currently responsible for the technology and the security, I think there's always a benefit for, working with or talking to an MSP, MSSP, or other similar resource who, is able to help lend that guidance and provide the additional support.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good way to wrap it up. So anybody that tuned in, we appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you around soon. We went about a year without recording a podcast. So now that we have Eric on board, maybe we can get a few more out there.